Sleep. It's something we do for nearly one-third of our lives. We lie down, we close our eyes, and we drift into dreams. It feels simple, almost ordinary. But without it, our bodies and our minds begin to collapse. We all know the feeling after one sleepless night. The heavy eyes, the foggy brain, the short temper. But what if you pushed beyond that? What if you forced yourself to stay awake, not for hours, not for one night, but for days? Would you discover new abilities hidden inside the brain, or would you slowly lose your mind? This question has haunted scientists, storytellers, and curious minds for decades, and it gave birth to one of the most chilling tales on the internet: the Russian sleep experiment. A story of prisoners, a mysterious gas, and a descent into madness that seemed too horrifying to be fiction. But here's the truth. The story never happened. It is a legend, a myth, a piece of online horror, and yet real experiments have been done. Real people have tested the limits of sleeplessness, and what science discovered is no less shocking. In this video, we'll move between myth and reality, from terrifying stories to documented science, and we'll ask one question that will stay with you until the end. How long could you survive without sleep? It begins with a story that's spread across the internet, whispered in forums, shared in late-night conversations, and written on websites dedicated to horror. A story so strange, so horrifying, that many began to wonder if it could be real. It was called the Russian sleep experiment. The tale claimed that sometime in the late 1940s, during the tense years after World War II, a group of Soviet scientists set out to conduct an experiment. Their goal? To test the limits of the human body and mind by removing something we all take for granted: sleep. 5 political prisoners were chosen as the subjects. They were promised freedom if they could survive the experiment. The task was simple, yet impossible: stay awake for 30 days straight. To make this possible, the scientists released a special gas into the sealed chamber where the men were held. This gas, they claimed, kept the prisoners alert and awake. Cameras and microphones recorded everything. The world outside the chamber waited. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The men were tired, yes, but still calm. They spoke to each other, told stories, sang songs, and even read books aloud to pass the endless hours. Their bodies adjusted to the constant light, the lack of natural day and night, and the strange taste of the air. But as the days stretched longer, the cracks began to show. By day 5, the men's conversations grew darker. They began to whisper, not to each other, but to themselves. Their voices trembled, carrying fragments of paranoia. Some claimed to hear noises. Others said they felt like they were being watched, not just by the scientists, but by something else. By day 10, the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted completely. The men were no longer a group. They were individuals, isolated and distrustful. They shouted at each other, accused each other of terrible things, and sometimes fell silent for hours. One man screamed so violently that his vocal cords tore, leaving him unable to speak again. And then, according to the tale, things grew darker still. The prisoners began to harm themselves. They ripped at their own skin, tore pieces of flesh, and smeared blood on the walls. Some refused food, some whispered prayers, others spoke in words that no one could understand. The scientists outside the chamber panicked. They wanted to open the doors to stop the madness. But when they tried, they faced something worse: resistance. The men did not want to leave. They begged to remain awake. They begged for the gas. When the chamber was finally opened, after nearly 15 days, what the scientists found was pure horror. The men had mutilated themselves beyond recognition. Their bodies were broken, but their eyes were wide open. When doctors tried to sedate them, they fought with unnatural strength, screaming, "We must remain awake." The story ends with a chilling line. that the subjects were no longer human, but something else, something that only emerged when sleep, that fragile, vital process, was stripped away. This, of course, is how the internet legend is told. But here's the truth. The Russian sleep experiment never happened. It is a work of horror fiction, born from the world of creepypasta, short, viral horror stories spread online. There are no Soviet records, no scientific papers, no witnesses. Investigators and fact-checkers have confirmed it is entirely a myth. And yet, despite this, the story feels possible. That is why it's spread. That is why people still whisper about it today. Because deep down, we all know how fragile the human mind becomes without rest. We've all felt the dizziness after one sleepless night. The irritability, the foggy brain, the strange feeling of unreality. Now imagine that not for hours, not for a single night, but for days. The myth was terrifying because it played on something real. The fear of what happens when the brain is denied the one thing it cannot live without. The Russian sleep experiment is not history, but it reflects a truth. Sleep deprivation can destroy us, and in the next chapter, we leave the world of internet horror and enter the world of science. A world where one teenager actually tested the limits of sleeplessness, and the results, though less bloody, were just as shocking. The myth of the Russian sleep experiment may be fiction, but in the real world, there was one teenager who truly tested the limits of sleeplessness. And he did it in front of scientists, doctors, and the press. His name was Randy Gardner, and in 1963, at just 17 years old, he set out to stay awake longer than anyone had before. What began as a simple science fair project in San Diego quickly grew into something much larger, attracting local reporters and eventually the attention of Dr. William Dement, one of the world's leading sleep researchers. At the time, the record for sleeplessness stood at about 260 hours, nearly 11 days, and Randy was determined to break it. The first days passed with difficulty, but without collapse. He played basketball, drank sodas, and chatted with friends to stay alert, but fatigue soon took its toll. His memory weakened, his speech became hesitant, and his mood shifted rapidly between laughter and irritation. As time dragged on, reality itself began to blur. He saw moving shadows where there were none, mistook a street sign for a living person, and described himself in moments of fantasy as if he were stepping onto a sports field as a famous player. His mind, deprived of rest, slipped further away from clarity. Doctors observed that his brain began to fall into microsleeps, tiny, uncontrollable blackouts lasting just seconds, even as his eyes remained open. This explained his strange behavior and lapses in thought. His coordination faltered, his hands shook, and conversations became increasingly disorganized. By the final days, his body was in full rebellion. Bloodshot eyes, slurred speech and paranoia, and yet, somehow, he pushed forward, determined not to give in. On January 8, 1964, after 11 days and 25 minutes awake, a total of 264 hours, Randy Gardner's record-breaking ordeal came to an end. When he finally lay down, the world expected him to sleep endlessly. Instead, he slept for about 14 hours, woke up groggy but functional, and within days returned to normal patterns. Unlike the horrors of fictional tales, there was no death, no madness beyond repair, and no monstrous transformation. But the experience was a powerful reminder. Sleep deprivation strips away sanity piece by piece, and no one can escape its grip. Randy's record remains the longest scientifically documented case of voluntary sleeplessness, and scientists today refuse to approve similar experiments, believing it far too dangerous to attempt again. His story stands not as legend, but as fact, proof of how fragile the human mind becomes when denied the simple, essential act of sleep. The Russian sleep experiment may have captured imaginations with its horror, but the contrast with Randy Gardner's real story reveals something far more fascinating about human nature and the brain. The myth was built on shock and terror, prisoners mutilating themselves, scientists losing control, and the suggestion that sleeplessness could awaken something monstrous within us. It was written like a nightmare come to life, and perhaps that is why it became so believable. Because deep down, everyone knows the feeling of fragility after even a single sleepless night. The story spread across forums and blogs in the early 2000s, a perfect piece of internet folklore. It looked like history, read like a secret file, and felt like the kind of experiment governments might actually attempt behind closed doors. But the truth is simpler and, in many ways, more unsettling. Reality does not give us cinematic horror. Instead, it gives us something quieter, a slow unraveling of the mind and body when deprived of one of life's most essential functions, sleep. Randy Gardner's ordeal showed this reality in stark clarity. He did not transform into a monster, nor did he lose his humanity in a blaze of violence, but his journey into sleeplessness revealed how fragile the brain truly is. His hallucinations arrived in whispers, not screams. Shadows moved where there were none. Words slipped away before sentences could finish, and emotions swung wildly from laughter to anger in the span of minutes. Unlike the horror story, the terror of the real world lies in how ordinary these breakdowns can feel. Hallucinations, confusion, paranoia, and emotional instability. These are the monsters of real sleep deprivation. They creep slowly, seeping into the edges of thought, until a person can no longer tell the difference between reality and imagination. Science tells us that the brain, desperate for rest, begins shutting down in tiny bursts called microsleeps. The eyes remain open, but the mind disappears for seconds at a time, like flickering lights in a failing power grid. The myth gave us mutilated bodies. Reality gives us a brain that quietly betrays itself. And yet, the overlap between myth and reality is important. Both stories, though vastly different, circle back to a single truth. Sleep is not a luxury. It is a biological necessity, as essential as food and water. Without it, no amount of discipline, strength, or determination can prevent the collapse of body and mind. The Russian sleep experiment exaggerates this collapse into horror, but Randy Gardner's experience demonstrates the evidence behind it. The myth thrives on fear, on the suggestion that we could lose ourselves in a violent, monstrous way. The reality thrives on data and observation, showing that sleeplessness changes us in quieter, more insidious forms. But both point to the same haunting lesson. Humans are not built to live without rest. And perhaps the most terrifying part is this: you don't need 30 days without sleep to begin losing yourself. Just a few nights are enough to warp perception, dull memory, and make the world feel unreal. That is why scientists today refuse to replicate Gardner's feat. To them, it is not entertainment or myth, but a dangerous line that should never again be crossed. The Russian sleep experiment will live on as a story meant to shock, but Gardner's 11 days remain the sobering evidence. His ordeal is the reminder that the border between sanity and chaos is not guarded by willpower or science, but by something as simple as closing your eyes at the end of the day. If the Russian sleep experiment is a story meant to frighten, and Randy Gardner's ordeal is proof of reality, then modern science is the bridge that explains why sleeplessness is so destructive. For centuries, people thought of sleep as wasted time, but neuroscience now shows that sleep is not rest, it is repair. Without it, the body and mind begin to break down. The brain is the first victim. Sleep allows neurons to reset, memories to form, and toxins to clear out through the glymphatic system. Skip sleep, and these processes stop. The result is instant: poor memory, slower reactions, mood swings, and confusion. Gardner's fading focus and sudden irritability were not mysterious. They were exactly what science predicts. But sleeplessness also disrupts the body. Hormones fall out of balance. Cortisol, the stress hormone, rises, while the hunger hormones ghrelin and leptin shift, making people crave food and gain weight more easily. Over time, chronic sleep loss raises the risk of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. The immune system weakens too. Sleep is when the body produces cytokines, proteins that fight illness. With too little rest, defenses collapse, leaving the body open to infection. In horror fiction, sleep deprivation destroys people violently. In reality, it destroys them slowly, through sickness and exhaustion. Perhaps the most disturbing effects are on the mind itself. Hallucinations, paranoia, and emotional instability are not signs of madness, but of a brain pushed beyond its limits. Without REM sleep, emotions cannot be regulated, and reality becomes distorted. Gardner's visions of shadows and feelings of paranoia were the natural outcome of his brain failing to cope. This is why no scientist today would repeat Gardner's record. Guinness World Records even stopped tracking sleep deprivation attempts, calling them too dangerous. Sleep is no longer seen as wasted time, but as the foundation of health and sanity. What Gardner endured in 11 days, the rest of us glimpse after a few restless nights. The fog, the irritability, the difficulty concentrating. The lesson is simple. Sleep is not optional. It is as essential as food and water. And while myths exaggerate the horror and Gardner's story shows the proof, science explains the truth. Without sleep, every part of who we are begins to crumble. The Russian sleep experiment remains one of the internet's most chilling legends, a story designed to shock, disturb, and linger in the imagination. But as we've seen, it is not history, it is fiction. No secret Soviet lab, no mutilated prisoners, no experiment lost to the shadows of war. It was a modern folktale, written to frighten us, and in that, it succeeded. Yet the true story of Randy Gardner is, in its own way, just as haunting. 11 days without sleep left him hallucinating, paranoid, and mentally unstable. His ordeal showed that sleep deprivation doesn't need monsters or hidden labs. The human brain itself becomes the battlefield. And when science steps in, the lesson becomes undeniable. Sleep is not optional. It is the foundation of memory, emotion, immunity, and health. Remove it, and everything else begins to collapse. That collapse may not look like horror movie violence, but it is real, measurable, and deadly over time. So, the myth and the truth together give us one clear message. We cannot escape our need for rest. Stories may exaggerate the fear, but science provides the proof. And perhaps the scariest thought of all is not a gas-filled Soviet chamber, but the simple reality that just a few nights without sleep can change who we are. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales where myth meets truth.